To start this off, what we like to do with our guests a lot of times here on this podcast is to ask them about their prior experiences, their own stories. And I'm sure that you have a very unique story of how you came to be at this point in your writing career and how you got started. So if you don't mind, just want to take a couple of minutes and just kind of let us know how you got started in writing and what the journey has been like for you specifically as you've made your way through a variety of outlets over the years.
For sure. I mean, I had a very indirect, I guess is probably the briefest way to to say, like, an indirect route to basketball writing, to sports writing. I've always been a writer. I've been writing since I was a kid. Big writer, big reader. Mostly kind of kept it to myself. In the past, the public facing writing I did was more kind of like personal essays. I've done some political writing, some writing on I guess like popular culture when I was working at Vice for a little while. But yeah, I have always had a day job, and they were in all different fields. So I mentioned Vice, so I worked in media. I also worked in publishing for a little while. I've worked in the arts. I worked for some not-for-profit arts institutions here in Toronto, where I'm from. I worked for a little while at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, but I always, I've loved basketball since I was a kid, and as I mentioned before, I've always, found time to carve out time for writing. Usually it was early in the morning or kind of late at night, and I was a little bit hesitant to make the jump into full-time freelance writing, which was always something I saw myself moving toward, because I think when you feel yourself constantly going back to something, which is what was the case for me, and in some cases, if I'm being totally honest, like drifting away, my interest like slipping or drifting away from those other jobs that I mentioned. And always writing was the thing that took precedent. And my journey into sports writing was also fairly indirect, at least the kind of sports writing I do now. So I got started with a website called The Classical, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But David Roth, who worked at Deadspin, now he works at Defector, started that with a couple people. And it was kind of like an early prototypic Deadspin, a little bit Grantlandian, maybe, like in that kind of era of sports blogging. And I wrote fiction. I wrote fictional NBA stories that were fairly loose, I'd say. Like I'm thinking of topics. One was about Paul Pierce being a vampire. Another one was about Chuck Hayes.
I've heard that one before. That's
definitely different. I mean, when you think about it a bit more, and you'll be like, I could see it. One was about Chuck Hayes driving a chuck wagon through Texas looking for a specific restaurant that I'd read about that he really liked, and getting lost and getting overtaken by a gang of bandits led by Matt Barnes and the Plumlee brothers. So it was a very it was super light. And I think for a while, again, if I'm being totally honest, I was fairly reluctant to get into sports writing as something, quote, seriously, because I think there's a real lack. It's changing, but there was definitely a real lack of women's voices in that space, or, the women's voices that were there were heavily critiqued, I'd say more so than men. And that still happens. But I got started writing about the Raptors, actually, in a more serious way, for a blog in Toronto called Raptors Republic, that a lot of great writers have come up and through, kind of. And then it just sort of spun out from there. I got good feedback. I got more comfortable with my voice when I started to realize, there's a lot of people that write about basketball in one very specific formulaic, X's and O's kind of analytics driven way. And that's never been what I've been most comfortable with. That's not really what my natural writing voice is. And I think once I got comfortable with being myself in that space and realizing that there was a bit of a gap and a niche that I could fill, things got a lot easier for me, I'd say. And I felt, kind of natural momentum pick up. I had some great opportunities. The timing wasn't great because the pandemic happened, but I didn't know at the time the pandemic was going to happen. But I had some great opportunities. One was being an embedded writer with the Toronto Raptors in the February before the pandemic. And I had another writer in residence role at a tech hub, at a tech startup in Toronto. So between those two things, I thought this is a good opportunity to try it full-time freelance and just write. But the pandemic turned out to work well in sports writing because everybody was stuck at home, as you know.
True. Yeah.
Yes. So it was a great opportunity to, call. I had some of my best, biggest profiles up to that point in that stretch because, yeah, you could, call up Stan Van Gundy, you could call up Becky Hammon, you could call up like a lot of the players who were trapped at home and bored and just wanted to talk. So
Mhm.
it worked out. That was about 2 years ago now, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
You know what, Katie? That's awesome. It definitely seems like you have a passion for this field and you tackle it from a perspective that I think people can underappreciate. There's something to be said about doing what you're doing. You were doing the fictional stories for a little bit, and a lot of people don't look at basketball in that way. It's a very non-fictional field. You
Mhm.
look at everything from black and white. But you kind of put a different spin on it that I think people don't really look at a lot of times. And so you said you're not really into the X's and O's side of basketball, but what I've come to appreciate, and I think a lot of people will too, once they kind of get away from that a little bit, is the fact that these players have stories of their own. They're not just people that just go on a court and robotic and just do scripted moves. I mean, they're human beings just like you and me. They have their own past, they have their own stories, their own journeys, just like you have. And it's really cool that we have people like you that take the time to talk to them and really dive into what makes them, what makes them unique. And what kind of brings about what happens on the court every night. So that's so awesome. And how was it for you when you got the opportunity to start interviewing these people, doing one-on-ones, doing feature stories, and kind of figuring out exactly what makes them tick? Like, was there a learning curve for you when it came to that? Having to kind of learn to speak to these people and get that information from them. Like, how was that adjustment for you once you kind of got into that part of it?
I think there's definitely a learning curve. I mean, I think, for me, it was twofold. I think it was entering that space for the first time. I remember the first like locker room post game interview I did. I was pretty nervous still. Like, and this was, I came from backgrounds where it was part of my day job to, cold call people, be very conversational with people. So I'm very comfortable with that side of things. But there's something about, I think, the barrier or the perceived barrier, right? Of like, one, these guys are at work, right? And you probably in most cases just watched them do very incredible things for 2 hours, and there's like a level of intimacy too, because they're like post game, maybe they lost a game, they're feeling bad, maybe they won, they're feeling great, but they're getting changed and like they're going back to their hotel or they're going home, they're like trying to kind of leave their day job behind them. So I think navigating that space, and I think navigating that space, as a woman in that space is a bit different too, because no one is awkward or weird about it, but there is an awareness, I think. But once I was comfortable with that, you just sort of realize these are conversations like you'd have with anyone else. Like you're definitely a professional, but I found the responses I got were when you sort of let the person lead. Like you have your questions and your beats you want to hit, especially if, they just had an incredible game and you're writing something off that game and you've got to get a quote or you've got to get them to mention a teammate or maybe something specific that they did on the floor that night. But otherwise, you can pretty quickly tell, what people are interested in, not interested in, the kind of ways that they may want to move the conversation, the things that may seem a little bit open ended, and they'd be welcome for a follow up question instead of just, blindly moving on to your next question, which can be hard to time because, as I mentioned before, nerves can be at play. Timing is a big thing. Like a lot of these guys watch the clock because they got to get to the team bus, if they're visiting. Those and like they'll definitely rush you out of locker rooms in that case.
Mhm.
But I found like for profile pieces, phone interviews, Zoom interviews, definitely a little bit easier because you've got a pretty long uninterrupted stretch of time.
Mhm.
But I think for me it's just again like approaching athletes like people because they are, as you mentioned, like that is where a lot of my interest in their stories comes from. Even when it comes down to gameplay, like why a certain game maybe got away from someone when like the game before they were incredible, right?
Mhm.
Or, if we're talking about the playoffs, like why one series can be so vastly different from another. Like what are the other elements at play? Like, sometimes it doesn't just come down to gameplay. I'd say, 90% of the time, it
Mhm.
doesn't just come down to gameplay. But I think, what I've learned that is that some players are more comfortable just talking X's and O's. Some are comfortable, but when you kind of get them away from it and I think they realize like, oh, I'm not going to get the same 5 questions that I always do, in a post game situation. They seem a little bit relieved or, more engaged than they would be because you're switching it up a little bit. So I think just learning to pay attention, do your research, go back and listen to the kind of questions that they get all the time and, trying not to hit on those same beats can really go a long way. And just, yeah, like being, I think, empathetic and open to people.